Hello and welcome. The members of our team are Antonio, Blake, and Ben. May we please have your name, branch, and rank?
My name is Michael H. Train. I served both in the Navy and the Army. In the Navy, I was a first class ET. In the Army, I was a staff sergeant. I'm going to kind of back up a little bit. I know one of the things that was asked of me to put in this is explain my family history. I come from what I classify as a true military family. We can trace our ancestral roots back to the Revolution. There's been a member of my family in some facet or other has been involved in every major conflict that this country's ever been in, up through and including Afghanistan. I had a nephew who served in Afghanistan. Coming forward a little bit, my father was a 19-year-old radioman on December 7, 1941. He was stationed on board the USS Honolulu. He was credited, I didn't know, my father passed away when I was 13 months old, so I really didn't know much about him, but my stepfather put me in touch with his ship, and I went to about 8 of their reunions and met a lot of guys who knew him throughout the war. One of them was a senior radioman in the radio shack that morning who sent me radio messages, and I thanked him for them on the phone. And he said, well, they have a particular significance to you. And I said, what's that? He said, your father transmitted every single one of them. And while he was telling me this, I was looking at the radio message that said, Air Raid Pearl Harbor, this is not a drill. And I saw that at the 25-year anniversary of Pearl Harbor. It was on the front cover of Saturday Evening Post, Life, Look, one of those magazines. And I said, are you sure? And he said, son, I was a senior radioman in the radio shack that day. I gave your father the order to transmit that message. So coming forward, as I say, describing my family as a military family. My father died, my mother remarried another sailor. My stepfather, early in my age, could see that I was very inquisitive. My stepfather actually was more responsible for me standing or sitting in this chair talking to you today than anything the Army or the Navy ever taught me. He taught me a lot of things growing up. He taught me celestial navigation. He taught me to sail. By the time I was 11 years old, I could take a cabin cruiser, plot a course from Milford, Connecticut to Boston and sail it by myself. Probably the most important piece of information he drummed in my head was landmarks. And at some point I'll get to that and you'll understand what I mean. He always told me, he says, remember landmarks. They never change. Everything around that landmark might change, but that landmark's still going to be there. And someday, it may be your salvation, maybe your way home. So that stuck in my mind. He did a lot of other things. My stepfather was a gunner's mate. He started teaching me to shoot when I was 11 years old. It was the first time he handed me the weapon that I carried on my side throughout my career in the Army. Was a Colt 1911-45. The first time I ever fired it put me on my butt. He says, get back up, you'll figure it out. My stepfather served during World War II, served during Korea, and during Vietnam. He didn't go to Vietnam, but he was in a reserve unit, and he was a recruiter. He recruited me. My stepfather swore me in. And one of the best pieces of information he gave me, he said, son, the Navy has some of the finest special training schools of all the armed forces. He says, take advantage of it. He says, and if you do well in the schools you go to, eventually they will ask you to go to school. And he was correct. I mean, I took a gloss over the schools, point out a few things, but I don't want to dwell on this that much. I went to gas turbine school. I went to small arms and munitions school. When I came out of that school, I was an expert on a number of handguns, rifles, and automatic weapons. I learned how to make my own dynamite in munitions school. I also became an expert in the use of C4, of plastic explosives, which would later on come into my career in the Army. I went to what's called traumatic triage school. It was not to be confused with a medic school or a corps school. The only thing they wanted you to understand was how to stabilize a patient until you could get them in the hands of somebody who could take care of them. The very last school I was asked to go to, and by this time I was stationed on, I go back up, I enlisted in the Navy the summer between my junior and senior year in high school, which was a one-year delayed entry program, and that allowed you to go to basic training, to go to training schools and things like that prior to graduating from high school. So this is when all of these training schools came into the picture. I was assigned to a ship in Newport, Rhode Island that was getting ready to go on a world cruise. It was called a Freedom Cruise. Freedom Cruise is, in the military, you get paid every 2 weeks. So on one of these tours, what you would do is you'd sail for a week, and on every payday, you'd pull into a new foreign port. To kind of put it in words that you guys would understand, that's like the Willy Wonka golden ticket. The odds of that happening in anybody's career are very, very slim. So that's a cruise. If you can get it, you want to go on it. Well, while they were preparing the ship for that, I was asked to go to survival school. Couldn't figure out why. I'm going to be on a ship. In order to justify it in my own mind, I realized, well, suppose the ship sinks and I end up on an island somewhere. I can survive. So I went to that school and learned an awful lot of things. The final exercise was they pair you up and they'd say, okay, we need you guys to go from point A to point B. And all the time that you're going to do that, they're going to be tracking you, and if they catch you, they'll put you in a mock POW camp. My partner was from the mountains of Colorado. I'm originally from Idaho, but when we moved back east, my stepfather, in addition to taking me out on the ocean, would take my brother and I hunting and fishing up in Vermont and New Hampshire, so I felt very comfortable. We both had a conversation. We decided we're not going to get caught. The final day of the exercise, well, we did some very unorthodox things. We did what they taught us. We did things we knew, and we kind of made things up. One of the things we did for the most part was at night we'd climb up in the trees and sleep. We'd just take our sleeves out and tie ourselves around the tree trunk. I never expected anybody trying to look up a tree looking for us. Another thing we did was we formed our own ghillie suits. You take some of the vegetation surrounding you, put it in your clothing. What I usually tell people is if you do it right, when you get through, you look like a scarecrow from the Wizard of Oz. But it's highly effective. You can actually blend right into the background. And it worked. We got passed probably 4 times by people who were looking for us. Sometimes within 2 or 3 feet of us, and they never saw us. So the final day of the exercise, this buddy of mine and I found ourselves about 50 yards away from the main gate of this POW camp. Nobody ever told us what to do if you got there. So as we're trying to figure out, should we go in, or what do we do? This Jeep comes driving up, and behind it was a deuce and a half. A bunch of guys jumped out of a deuce and a half. I realized the passenger in the Jeep was the commandant of the school, so we got as close as we dared, and he was not happy. He said, we've never lost anybody in the history of the school, and we're not going to do it under my command. So I yelled out, we're over here. We stood up and waved to him, and he says, come over here. When we got over to him, I figured he was going to chew us out. Well, he didn't. He says, when you two get cleaned up, I want to see you in my office. So we got cleaned up, went to his office, and went in. He says, do you guys have any idea of the significance of what you just did? I said, no, it's only 6 men have ever done it before. So he says, you're number 7 and 8. And he immediately offered us a position at the school. Well, my partner jumped on it. And I explained to him about this cruise. I said, I'm going on that cruise. So I went back to my ship. He handed me his card, and he said, if you ever change your mind, contact me, and I'll get you back here. So I went back to the ship. We prepared to get underway. And 3 days out at sea, I was summoned to the executive officer's stateroom. When I got there, he says, can you think of any reason that you would be taken off of this ship? And I said, no. They told us to have you pack your sea bag, we're sealing your records, and there's a helicopter going to come over and pick you up. And it did. Went over to the aircraft carrier. As soon as I got off, one of the guys grabbed my sea bag and said, "This will catch up to you." Two guys took me out into a flight ready room, put me in a G suit, set me up with a helmet, and it took me back down to the flight deck. And I get a tap on my shoulder, and it's a pilot. He says, "Are you my passenger?" And I said, "Well, I'm probably the only person you don't know." "I guess I am." So he proceeds to strap me into the back seat of an F4. And all the time he's doing it, he's telling me what not to touch. And the last thing he told me was, when we take off, if you feel the need, pointed down between my legs, and there were 3 little bags. He says, "Don't mess up my plane." I said, "Okay." We took off, and you go from 0 to 170 miles an hour in about 3 or 4 seconds. I mean, it was an amazing feeling. I figured we were going to head back to the East Coast, and we didn't. We continued flying northwest, or northeast, excuse me. And so I asked the pilot, I said, "Where are we going?" He said, "I don't know where you're going." He said, "I'm dropping you off in Spain. I'm going back to the ship." So when we got to Spain, I got picked up by a Jeep that took me over to Supply, and they gave me a bag that had toiletries, socks, clean underwear, stuff like that I would need. And they drove me around the other side of the base, and there was a C-130 waiting. I got on the C-130, and I realized I was the only passenger on board that C-130. It was me and a bunch of equipment. So as soon as we got airborne, I asked the crew chief where we were going. He said, "I don't know where you're going." He says, we're dropping this off in Italy. We're taking an empty back." Long story short, 3 hops later, we landed at Utapao Air Force Base in Thailand. Utapao Air Force Base, the largest Air Force base in the world. As I'm deplaning, there's a colonel in a Jeep sitting over there, and he's got a little duck-billed cap on, flight glass, a cigar sticking out of his mouth. He's got his shirt sleeves rolled up and turned to, and his feet are up. So I backed up onto the plane. I thought, in my mind, I said, "They must be making a movie here," something like that. I just never expected I'd see a colonel in that way. He yelled out my name. So I went down. I got out of the Jeep. He never said a word. We drove off. He took me to Supply, and we started going around. They measured me for a helmet, flight suit, boots, everything I needed. And somewhere along the line, the colonel disappeared. But my last station was they were going to issue me a sidearm. And sergeant asked me what I wanted, and I said I want a 45. So he slides a used one across the bench at me, and I said, "No, I want a new one." He said, "You can't have a new one." I said, "But I want a new one." Well, our voices, we weren't arguing, but our voices just kind of got higher. The colonel comes around the corner and says, "What's going on?" And the sergeant says, "He won't take the weapon I want to give him." And the colonel looked at me, and I said, "If you're issuing me a sidearm, it's prudent of me to believe that at some point in time I'm going to need that thing to protect myself or someone else. It's your current." I said, "Well, I want one that works." The sergeant said, "Well, these are all certified." And I said, "I don't care if it's certified or not." I said, "Do me a favor, put a new one here and that one there." And I proceeded to completely dismantle them. All along the way, I was pointing out things on the used one that I didn't like. It didn't look right. Put them both back together. I loaded both of them. Took the used one, pulled the slide back on it, put it over my head, took off the safety, pulled the trigger, and it went click. Put the safety back on, laid it back down. I said, therefore, the very first time I used it could very well have been my last. I took the new one, did exactly the same thing, pulled the trigger on it, and if you've ever heard a 45 go off, it's like being inside of a bass drum when somebody hits it. I got my new weapon. I told him, I said, "I want a used holster. I don't want a new one. I don't want to break it in." So we finally got back out in the Jeep. I looked at the colonel. I said, "Okay, can you tell me why I'm here?" And he said, "Yes." He said, "We're pulling people in for a combined forces operation," and explained the little mechanics of it. And my mind is thinking, he said, before you open your mouth, if we had brought in a group of first air cav, he says, that's a matter of public record. That's troop movement. He said, that would have been on the front page of the Washington Post tomorrow morning. But if we said, hey, you Mr. Sailor, you Mr. Soldier, you Mr. Airman, you Mr. Marine, you Mr. Coast Guardsman, and took you individual movement is not public record. He says, so we look for people who had multiple talents. He says, when your record popped up, the first thing we saw was survival school. And he looked at me and said, which, by the way, is now jungle warfare and survival school. He says, then we started looking at your records and we looked at all of the schools you went to. He says, you fit more talent, more abilities than almost anybody we have. And he told me then, he says, you don't have to stay. He said, but you have to sign a statement of confidentiality. If you go back to your ship, you can't tell anybody where you went. If you stay here and go through with these operations, you can't discuss that when you get back home. So I decided to stay. And I said, what do you want? What am I going to do? He said, you're going to be an aircrew chief in a helicopter. And I said, I've never been on a helicopter in my life. He said, you went to gas turbine school. I said, yes, I did. He says, you graduated #1 in your class. I said, yes, I did. He said, the turbine you worked on is the same turbine that drives a Huey. I said, oh, okay. And then he went on and hit all of these schools I went to and what I did and how well I had scored. And after that, it started to make sense. So I told him, I said, I'll stay. And he says, I looked at him and I said, I've had a philosophy since I was a little kid. You are where you are at any given point in time for a reason. It may not be clear to you. It may become clear and it may never become clear. But you're there for a reason. I said, I'm here. I must be here for a reason. So he looked at me and said, I hope everybody else feels the same way. I don't think we ever had anybody back out. Most of our pilots already served at least one tour in Vietnam. When they heard about these operations, they volunteered to come. It was the guys in the back that they had to pull in and see if they'd stay. He says, pilot's a pilot. And he says, but the guys in the back, we need people who are have multiple talents. And he says, you fit so many of them. He says, it's not fun. With my medical ability, I was the only aircrew chief on the flight line that carried a medical bag. So our primary operations, we trained at Utapao. And as I said, Utapao was the largest Air Force base in the world. The colonel once told me, he says, there are men who've been stationed here for 6 years, don't know where we are. They have no idea where we are. We're still on the base. So we trained there, and from there we went up north, where all of our missions emanated, which was at a Royal Thai Air Force base at Nong Kham Phanom. We were officially the guest of the Thai government. All of our helicopters were painted black. We had gunship crews and we had slicks. I was the aircrew chief in a slick, which is a Huey that only has 2 door guns. Most Hueys come equipped with 60 calibers. We specifically requested a 50 in each door for a number of reasons. Obviously very powerful. At times you could fire, even if you're firing it over somebody's head, you'd scare the heck out of them, and they would stop firing at you. But our missions were insertion and an extraction of scouts. We would drop them. We flew exclusively into Cambodia and Laos. We were going in the back door. At the time, if you came in and incurred from Vietnam, there was all sorts of hell to pay. But by flying in, like I said, our helicopters were painted black. We couldn't wear any identification, dog tags, anything. Couldn't carry anything personal with us. The deal was if you got shot down and you couldn't get picked up, they'd search for you for 5 days. After 5 days, you were on your own. Like I said, one of our missions was insertion and the other extraction of scouts. I separate the two because inserting is easy. We don't even land. They would just jump out. Extraction, on the other hand, was much more dangerous issue, because the longer they were in the field, the higher the likelihood would be that they would be detected and tracked. These guys would track them, and knowing a helicopter was going to come. Why take these two guys out when we get the helicopter and the two guys? So your LZ, when you went to pick somebody up, could go red like that, frequently did. One of the things I tell people is, in a situation like that, flying where we were, it was never a question of if you were going to get shot at. The question was always when. When was it going to happen? So you were living on an adrenaline high all the time. One of the other missions we did was when the B-52s took off on a bombing run. They always took off with a full load of bombs and a half a load of fuel, and the reason for that is they couldn't get off the ground with a full load of both. So as soon as they got up in Cambodian airspace, they would hook up to a KC-135, a tanker, and they'd top them off. But while they were flying this way, we were flying this way, just in case something happened, we could effect a rescue. And that, thank God, never happened. We didn't have a problem there. The other thing that we did was based on intelligence that the scouts brought back. Probably one of the most dangerous missions that I was ever on is we knew they were building underground supply depots just inside Cambodia, Laos. And the Cambodians and the Laotians were turning a blind eye to them being there. And based on this information, if we could find it, they did it with such impunity that they never manned them. The Tet Offensive occurred. They had all of these strung up and down inside the border. And then on a given day and time, they would come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and guys would drop off to where these supply depots were. They'd man them. And the first Tet, it didn't go off as totally as planned, but pretty well as planned. At exactly the same time, they all charged into Vietnam. Based on this intelligence, my door gunner and I, the helicopter would land a distance away, and we would make our way to where one of the tunnels was, and we would go in. The door gunner would, as soon as we found a map room, he'd grab everything that was in and take off. My function was then to proceed in and out of every room that was there and string it up with C4. And then when I get outside, the only way you can set C4 off is to pass an electrical charge to it. That's the only thing that'll set it off. It's a very stable, probably the most stable explosive I ever used. You can roll it up in a ball, throw it around. You can cut a cube off, set it on fire, and heat your meal. That's how stable it is. The electrical charge is what does it. So my job then was to get outside, get a safe distance away, and blow it up and down. And that rendered that supply depot useless. They'd have to dig it out. So I personally went on 5 of those missions. It started to get to the point where they realized this was going on. The first thing they did was they put traps in there. To get in, you had to get down on your stomach and shimmy in. I had a flashlight in this hand of my 45. The flashlight had a red lens in it, so you didn't mess up your eyes. And I saw this before I got to it. There was an opening. They dug a hole, and they put punji sticks in there. A punji stick is a sharpened piece of bamboo with human excrement on it. So if you did this, it would go right through your hands, and I would be lucky because I was in a helicopter. But if you were in the field, the odds of you surviving long were very, very bad. You would infect very quickly. But I happened to see that. What they did was when they were in there, they had a board over it. When they left, they take the board with them. So I just crept over it and went in. One of the other tunnels I went into, they took pit vipers and tied them by their tails and had them hanging up. Well, I knew there was nobody in there, so I just took the flashlight and I shot the heads off the pit vipers and went in and did my thing. Well, then they started leaving, I don't know how many men, but the very last one that I went into, I was shimmying my way down, and a head popped out. As soon as the head popped out, I pulled the trigger, I backed out, ran back to the helicopter, and I said, that's it, I'm not doing that anymore. I haven't been here this long to get shot at in one of those stupid supply depots. So I never did that anymore. In the time that I was there, overall I ended up being shot down 3 times. First 2 times we were able to get about 5 or 10 miles away from where we got hit to set down, and we got picked up relatively quickly by another crew that was out in the area. The very last day that I flew there was not supposed to be my last day. It was a long day. We flew 3 to 5 missions every day. Well, this is a real long, this is a 5-mission day. Our last mission was to pick up 2 scouts that were just on the east side of the Mekong River. The Mekong River is a natural border between Thailand and Cambodia and Laos at certain points. Well, we were so close I could see the river, so I knew how close we were. We picked up these 2 scouts. We got 50, 60 feet in the air, and all hell broke loose. I was with a new air crew. The 3 guys on his crew were very new. And it was some of the heaviest fire that I'd ever seen the whole time I was there. And at one point, it was like somebody had turned off the light switch. The turbine just went poof. And as we were falling, it was just as though all 4 of us had rehearsed it. You could hear going through our headsets was, oh shit. So we hit. And I was on my side. Configuration of that helicopter is pilot right seat, co-pilot left seat, door gunner right side, crew chief left side. And the reason for that is you now have visual contact in addition to verbal. Okay, well, I got thrown back into what's called the pocket, and I hurt my back real bad. I didn't know what it was at the time. Well, the 2 scouts did not know standard operating procedure, which was, unless you're on fire, you stay with that ship until your gunship comes up on station and provide cover. The first thing they did was he hit the door. They hit the wrong door. They hit the side where the fire was coming from. They were both killed instantly. We slid out. The pilot and co-pilot had early on, based on information they got from the first pilot I flew with, but he told them, he says, if you ever get on the ground, they can't pick you up. You let this guy take over. He's good on the ground. So they made that agreement with me. And I told him, I said, that's fine. I said, but if you question anything I do, it's on you. You take over. Well, God bless them. They never, ever asked what I was doing. I knew we couldn't head for the river. Because if I was in charge of that many men, I would have said fan out north and south of the river and wait. Just wait for them to cross. Well, I knew one thing that they didn't know, and that was that for 5 days they'd look for us. So my primary goal at that point was to put as much distance between that ship, or that crash site, and them as possible in 5 days. So I didn't want to go north, I didn't want to go south, and the only option was to head for Vietnam. We were roughly 165 miles away from Vietnam at that point. Remember when I said landmarks? I'd flown out there so long, I'd done enough night ops and day ops. I knew just inside the border, northwest of Pleiku, there was a fire base. After the first Tet Offensive, they set up a whole perimeter of fire bases just inside Vietnam. Some of those were operational for maybe 2 years, and then they pulled them out because subsequent Tet Offensives didn't go as far south. That was one that probably ended up being closed, but it was still operational at the time. And I'd seen it hundreds of times. I also knew that at that time of the year, every night, directly over that fire base, there was a bright star. I knew I had to get up in the trees to take a compass heading and to take a heading on that star. At the time, we were 3 canopies deep in the jungle. The jungle grows over itself. That's 1, 2, 3. Broad daylight in a 3 canopy deep jungle. You can't see the sun. It's almost like dusk all the time. At night, it's pitch black. You can't see that far in front of your face. But that's where I headed. I headed for that fire base. I knew that would get us out. At one point, like I say, I used to go up in the trees at night, stay there, and then to come down in the morning. And at one point, I was like I said, I hurt my back. I was giving myself morphine shots, a hip shot every night. I did that for 20 days until my back got to the point where it didn't hurt anymore. One morning when we were in one canopy deep. It wasn't even a canopy. It was clear, relatively clear. And I was sleeping on the ground. I woke up one morning and I could feel a depression right here on my chest. I didn't know what it was, but I looked over there and the 3 crewmen over there were just looking at me. It was panic look. So I did one of these real slow and I saw color and I knew what it was. It was a bamboo snake. A bamboo snake is one of the most deadly snakes in the jungle. In Vietnam, they referred to them as 2-step, 3-step, or 5-step, with the logic that if you get bit by one, 2 steps, 3 steps later, you'd be dead. Not entirely true. If they bit you in the right place and got a vein, a big vein or something, possibly, it would make you very, very sick. And at this point, I did not want to get very, very sick. So I just laid there. As you know, snakes are reptiles. Reptiles are cold-blooded. Apparently, my body heat was warmer than the jungle floor at night. He was asleep. As soon as the sun got to the right angle, he woke up and it slithered away. So at that point, I started to shake and started to sweat bullets. But we continued on. We got to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, or actually it was called Highway 1 at that point. Highway 1 is literally like the Pennsylvania Turnpike. And when we got there, there was a lot of movement coming down the highway. So what we decided to do is we'd stay up on the ridge, and at night, one of us would go down in the bushes, and if there was a break, they'd come up and get everybody and we'd run. Second night was my turn. So I went down the side of the road, and I'm in the bushes, and all of a sudden one of the guys turns and comes walking off the road to me. And I couldn't figure, how did he see me? So I couldn't shoot him, so I pulled out my survival knife. I figured if I had to, I'd give him a heart shot, and he would die instantly. But I sat there. He was so close to me, I could feel his body heat. And I'm thinking, great. Well, then it became very evident why he walked off the side of the road. He relieved himself on me. Now, there's an old saying, and I'll tell you what it is. It's a lot better to be pissed off than pissed on. And it's true. I figured this was a bad omen, so I went back up the hillside, and one of the guys got close enough to me, he backed off. He says, whoa. I took off my weapon. There was a stream up there. I went and just laid it. The following night, the guy on the side of the road is coming up, and we're coming running down. He says, how come you're coming down? I said, it's dead silent. He says, yeah. He says, all of a sudden, whatever passed, that's it. So we ran into Vietnam. We got about maybe 800 yards or so, and all of a sudden, the fire base lit up, and it was firing northeast over our heads. Or northwest over our heads. And a bombing run was coming out of Vietnam. And what they were told is if you have any unspent ordnance, drop it in Cambodia and Laos. They will not allow you to land if you have live ordnance on board. So they dropped whatever they had left. They were close enough to us where the initial round knocked us off our feet. And when it was over, the wind was such, I could smell cordite. That's how close we were to that. So we got a little further in and got off this path around, and I told the guys, I said, let's be quiet. If a patrol comes out, don't say anything. They're going to be trigger happy. They'll shoot first to talk to you later. And we heard one go by, and heard him come back. The following morning, we were probably about halfway up the hill to this fire base, and a patrol comes down. I see these 4 airmen, and I never heard any news of anybody being shot down. Well, we got up to the top, we told them who to contact, and we got cleaned up, they fed us, and the commanding officer in charge of the fire base came up. These guys must be pretty important. They sent a helicopter up here with a major in to pick you up. We flew from there to Pleiku and refueled, and then from there we went up to Da Nang. And they brought us to a hospital. Actually, at one point, the main pilot asked me if I thought the colonel would be there. I said, oh yeah. He said, where do you think he'll be? I said, he'll meet us on the tarmac. And I said, he will look exactly the same as he did the first day I saw him, and I described him. And we landed, there he was, exactly the same. So we got out, and these 3 guys jumped in the back of the Jeep. They knew I knew him very, very well. So I got in the front with him. We started to take off, and he stopped. He says, you know, you were being tracked the whole time. I said, well, I figured that. I said, but I also knew I had a 5-day head start. And I said, it probably took him a little while to figure out where I might have gone. He started to take off again. He stopped and he looked at me. He says, oh, by the way, you have 2 more nicknames. I looked at him. The guys back at the base used to call me the Cat. I'd get shot down, but I always came back. He said, well, there's 2 more nicknames. I said, well, okay, what are they? He said, the guys back at the base are now calling you Magnet Ass because you seem to attract fire. I thought it was kind of funny. I said, what's the other one? He said, well, we were intercepting their radio message the whole time. And he says, one of the very last radio messages, and I'll have to explain to you the significance of it. He says, the Vietnamese consider themselves the masters of the jungle. If anyone or any group beats them at that, they'll nickname them. I said, okay. He says, one of the last radio messages that we intercepted was, we have lost all contact with the ghost. He says, you're the ghost. They couldn't find him. I said, okay. Maybe someday I'll meet the guy who nicknamed him. They brought us to Da Nang. We were in a hospital. They were checking us out. And they said, except for the fact that you've all lost a fairly extreme amount of weight, you're in extremely good physical condition. I usually ask people to ask this question, or make them ask it, but I'll tell you right up front, there's an awful lot of edible vegetation and things you can eat in a jungle to survive. The hardest thing to find is water. We found these plants that had leaves that were like bowls. So the very first job you had every morning was to go around and gorge yourself. You could still get some throughout the day, but you wanted to drink as much water as possible. I also fashioned some bamboo into spears. Growing up in Connecticut, we'd go spearfishing. And I noticed fish in some of these bodies of water we were passing. So I went out one time, and I brought in I was shocked when I saw them. I brought in 3 trout. And I didn't find out until months and months later that trout are also indigenous to Cambodia, and I didn't know that. So I'm cleaning them, and these guys are running around. I said, what are you doing? They're getting ready to start a fire. I said, why don't you just take your guns out and shoot them in the air? I said, you know, they can smell the smoke. They said, what are you going to do? I said, well, it's good enough for the Japanese. I guess it's good enough for me. It was the first time I ever in my life ever ate raw fish, but it was good. And there was enough of a supply where we got some every couple of days or so, plus, like I say, vegetation, there's fruits and things like that. At any rate, I'll encapsulate this. I had flown a total of 563 air combat and search and rescue missions while I was there. I'd been shot down 3 times. I didn't know until I got back to our base that I turned 20 years old while I was missing. I had other things on my mind, but and when I got home, I wasn't old enough to drink. And another thing I usually tell people is, like I say, everything at that base was on the house. I drank more bourbon and sour mash whiskey the whole time I was there than any 10 people deserve to drink in their entire lives. But I'm like the tail end of the cocktail generation. And we didn't smoke pot or any of that nonsense there. We drank. I would say when I got back to the States, I wasn't old enough to drink. That's pretty much my story.
I have one question.
Sure.
How did you feel when you found out that the Vietnamese were calling you the ghost?
I thought it was, actually, believe it or not, to me it was kind of an honor to find out that somebody, would do that. I had no idea that they nicknamed people who would beat them at their own game. So it was kind of an honor.
Can you explain what all your gear was?
I'll tell you what, somebody hand me stuff and I'll tell you what you got. This is my helmet. On each side you'll see a button. And what it is, it's a different lens. This is what you use for night fights, on night ops. And this is what we did, we wore during the day, to keep the glare of the sun out of our faces. It's very old. When I pass it around, I usually tell people to be very careful. It's probably older than your father, maybe older than your grandfather. These are Nomex flight gloves. People always ask me about it because I tell them that the temperature out there can get up to 116 degrees. And the first thing somebody says, well, if it's 116, why are you wearing gloves? Well, if it's 116 degrees outside, how hot do you think a trigger mount is on a gun? About 116 degrees, so you'd wear these. These are essentially like potholers. If you watch NASCAR, these are the same gloves that those guys wear. So you could give them to your mother and she could reach in and pull a casserole out and never burn her hands. They're some of the best gloves I've ever had in my life. These are examples of what we fired out of our door guns. These are 50 caliber rounds. Normal Huey comes with a 60 caliber. We specifically asked them to mount 50 caliber guns on our slicks. Main reason, first of all, it's a lot more powerful. We found at certain times we could fire it just across the tree line over the heads, and they would drop. It makes an incredible sound, and it scares the heck out of you. Okay, this is how they came. We had sitting behind us in the back a wooden trunk, effectively is what it was, and there were two bandoliers, one for each gun. I can't remember how many thousand rounds that we fired, but this is how they came out. So those are ammunition. This is a flak jacket. It's not bulletproof. You can shoot a bullet right straight through it. Matter of fact, on the label in the middle there, it tells you that. Air crews didn't wear them. We folded them up and we sat on them. And the main reason for that is two of the biggest wounds that were incurred by helicopter cruisers. They got shot in their feet or shot in their butt. If a pilot could get two, he would put one on his seat and sit on it, and he'd put the other one down by his feet and put his feet on it. Nobody ever wore them. And if you pick it up, you'll find out why you really didn't want to wear one in 116 degree weather. It's a pretty hefty piece of equipment there. Any other questions?
Yes.
Now, from our previous interview, do you think you could explain what you did after you were in service?
What happened when I came home?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, but first of all, when we were at non-combat Phnom, we were very, very isolated. We received very, very little news from the outside world, and there was a reason for that. They wanted us to concentrate on what we were doing, what our job was. I did not know until I came home that Martin Luther King or Bobby Kennedy were assassinated. I did not know that until I came home. I also didn't know, when I went before I went, the United States was right behind the war. I was in Grand Central Terminal with a friend of mine one time in uniform. We walked out one side and there was a bomb Hanoi, or a demonstration against the war. They were small, but they existed. So we walked across the terminal and went out the other side. It was a bomb Hanoi. These people saw us in our uniforms, kind of picked us up on, put them on our shoulders. They asked where we were going. They said, we got a layover and we want to get something to eat. They found a restaurant for us, brought us in there and paid for our meal. So this is what I was used to. While I was gone, the country had done a 180. And all the demonstrations were going on, people hated. I was on a flight, and a businessman was sitting next to me. He says, are you coming home? I said, yeah. And he said, I'd change into civilian clothes if I was you. I said, why? He said, you'll find out. I figure this guy knows something I don't know. So as soon as I got off the plane, I headed for the nearest men's room. I never made it. My first welcome home was a guy walking in the opposite direction of me, leaned over and spit on me and called me a baby burn. And I had no idea why. I was so shocked that I did not even react. I didn't know what to do. I made my way to a men's room, cleaned my uniform off, put civilian clothes on. I never wore my uniform in public ever again after that. When I traveled, at some point they started telling guys not to wear it in public because it was so bad. And just for that reason alone, I would travel with my uniform. Wear my uniform on base, but I would never wear it in public ever. The first person to realize that was my mom. So I thought you were very proud of your service. And I said, yeah. But you have to realize my mother didn't know where I was. I had a system for writing to my parents and my girlfriend that they never caught on to. I had had a bunch of ships stationary, but whenever I wrote home, I had a buddy on my ship, and I would write letters, a whole series of letters, and up with a stamp line I put a number on it, and that was the order he was to mail them. And I told him how often, how frequent to mail, and I would mail them to him in a manila envelope. Well, any of my mail, he had the mail guy on our ship trap my mail, and he would mail it to me. The only thing he knew is I was not on a ship anymore because my address was not an FPO, it was an APO. So he knew I wasn't on a ship. Matter of fact, when I returned to the ship, he started talking about it. I said, I can't really talk about it right now. I said, maybe someday I'll talk to him and I'll tell you something, tell you what happened. But that was my welcome home.
You said you went through the tunnels that they would use as storehouses. What was is that a huge threat to the U.S. military?
What we did by taking those out saved, I would say, countless lives of servicemen and civilians. Because that's all that was there. That was stockpiled there to run into Vietnam and attack. We took everything away from them at that location. It was no longer useful to them. So 4 times that I was involved, I don't know how many other times other guys were doing the same thing, 4 of those were taken out of commission. So that removed all of that ammunition, all those weapons, all that food, everything. We removed that from the enemy. It actually removed his ability to wage war out of that area.
You said you flew a Huey.
Mm-hmm.
I know the Chinook was also a new helicopter in the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
Do you think that the Huey was superior to the Chinook, or the other way around?
Well, they were kind of for 2 different purposes in some ways. With what we did, a Chinook would not have been a thing flying. Huey served the best purpose with that. Bringing troops in like they did. A very close friend of mine in 1970 was a gunship pilot in Vietnam. He flew out of a base called Bearcat. And the operations that they did, where they were ferrying guys out into the field and they would come back and pick them up and all that, it was very, very effective for that. Chinooks did come into the picture, and in some cases they did use them to drop troops and all that, but a lot of times they went from base to base and did things like that. You didn't find them out, not that you wouldn't, but you didn't find them out in the field as often as you did a Huey. The Huey was the preferred vehicle.
And the other one?
I was just wanting to know, you said you were on that world cruise for about 3 days before you were called onto the Combined Forces unit. what was your reaction when you declined to stay after the survival exercise to go on that cruise and you just got pulled off?
And I got pulled up. Like I say, I was confused. I didn't know what was going on. You know, like I think of it as somebody's got other ideas for me. You know, and as it turned out, they did have other ideas for me. But yeah, and I'd love to have gone on that cruise. Trust me. By the way, one of the ways I ended up coming back, I came back almost the same way I went. But they flew me back on a C-140, which was jet and could do mid-air refueling. But as it was, I came back. They picked me up in Spain, but they didn't pick me up in a jet because the returning aircraft carrier was not jet equipped, so they had to bring me on what's called a COD, Carrier Onboard Delivery. It's a twin-engine plane, and as a result of all that, I was a day late getting back to the ship. And one of the ways, when I finally did tell my mother, she was 70 years old when I told her this. What happened was because I was not on that ship, they kept the entire squadron at sea one more day. They told them we had gone through a hurricane, and that slowed us down. That didn't happen. They got me back onto the carrier. As soon as I was off the carrier and the helicopter was back, because they were from Norfolk, Virginia, they booked, and we pulled in back into Newport one day late. Like I said, they told everybody that they were late because they went through a hurricane, which didn't happen.
What is one huge takeaway from your experience in the military that will stick with you for your whole life?
Actually, just the sheer overall experience. The one thing I get asked from time to time is, you know, were you scared? And I said, you'd be kind of lying if you said you weren't scared to some degree. But what happens is that's when all of your training kicks in. And you don't react to a given situation, you act upon that situation. That's when a lot of things, you know, happen. I used to jump out if one of the scouts got hit in an LZ. I'd unplug and jump out and go get him. And that's when my 45 came into the picture. I used it to protect us. Sometimes our gunship, because of that, couldn't acquire a target because I was in the way. Sometimes our aircraft was in the way, so there were times when they were ineffective, but it was a matter of circumstance. I had one occasion where when you fire a 45, you don't want to fire out in the field. You don't want to empty that clip. You want to leave one round in the chamber because that means there's gas in there. So all you have to do is drop the clip, put another one in, and continue to fire. Otherwise, you have to stop, pull a slide back, start all over again. So it's a matter of doing what you're doing, pulling a guy with this hand, firing, and counting at the same time, so you can achieve that. I had one occasion when I went out. I had a clip in the gun. I had 3 clips here, and I had a 6-pack behind me on my belt. And I had an occasion to go through 3 clips. In the last clip, I could see.
Ready.
Nope.
So you can go.
Okay, well, when I got back on board, I worked on Scout, took care of it, and got through. My door gunner said, he said, "Did you notice how the gunfire got real quiet there?" And I said, "Well, the gunship was, coming up on." He says, "He couldn't acquire a target." He says, "You were in the way most of the time. He couldn't really acquire a target." He said, "It was because of you." And I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "I counted 19 shots." And I said, "Okay." I figured out. I said, "Yeah, that's probably right." And he says, "Do you know every single one of those shots was a headshot?" I said, "I wasn't kidding." He said, "I've never seen anybody can do that." He said, "It never looked like you were aiming." He says, "You were like just pointing the gun." And I said, "Well, if you've ever fired as many rounds through one of these as I have, you can understand that. It becomes an extension of your hand, and you know exactly where to fire. People who've never fired a 45, first thing they try to do is like this and fire. This is the first thing that happens.
So you don't fire it that way. What you do is you drop, and as you're dropping, you fire it. And it's not as sharp, but you pull the trigger exactly where you want it, at the point you want it, and it'll do one of these. But if you hold it out like this and fire, you won't hit the target because this is the first thing that'll happen. So you have to understand how to fire a 45. That's how you fire a 45. Most people don't know that. I was one of the few guys on the line that carried a 45 and used to laugh at me because I was the smallest guy. All the pilots carried 38s. And asked me, I said, why do you carry that cannon? I said, because when I hit them, I don't want them to get back up. I said, even if I don't kill them, I want them to think, do I really want to get back up? I told my first pilot, I said, after you shoot you out there, I said, if we get shot down and we start to get overrun, I said, don't fire it. He said, what do you mean? I said, hold it by the barrel. I said, because you'll need the weight. And I said, when they get close enough to you, I said, beat them in the forehead with it. I said, you can fire 6 shots out of a 38 into a guy, he'll keep coming at you. I said, I'll hit him with 1 shot and that guy's down. I don't care where I hit him. As long as I hit him, he's going down. And like I said, he's going to lay there for a while if he's still alive, and he's going to think to himself, do I really want to get back up? I said, odds are very slim that he will get back up. That's my 45 story.
You said that you, near the beginning, that you did not want to take the use. How do you think your experience, just by what just happened and you just told us, if you had the use that didn't function properly, what do you think would have changed in your whole military career?
It might have ended right there. It very well could. Because when we get into serious firefights, you need a weapon that's going to work. If it's not going to work, what use is it? It's of no use. But I'd say my stepfather had me firing a 45 from the time I was 11. One thing I didn't tell you is by the time I was 14, I could do something that most men, that's their favorite weapon, can't do. One thing I learned to do, you can field strip a 45. In order to break it completely down, there's one tool you need. By the time I was 14, if you laid that tool right there and you didn't pick it up and move it, it stayed there. You could blindfold me. I could completely tear that thing down, blindfold it, and put it all back together. And I've said this before veterans groups, and I have invariably, there's at least one person there who'll look at me and say, I love the 45, it's my favorite weapon. I can't do that. But I said, I started shooting when I was 11. You know? I said, how long have you been shooting? And I said, have you ever bothered to try to do it? I said, it became a game with my stepfather. And he could see how well I could handle it and how it would take. And he says, let's see if you can do it blindfolded. And it took me a couple of times, and after that, blindfolded was nothing. But it was a game between my stepfather and I. See, as I said, a lot of the reason I'm sitting here talking to you right now, it has more to do with things he taught me than anybody in the military ever taught me.
And can you give us one experience or memory you would like us to archive from your whole military career?
There's really so many. And the one thing I was very fortunate with when I came home was I had short hair. I had no facial hair. I lost about 1/3 of my body weight in the jungle. When I got to Da Nang, I weighed just under 100 pounds. So I looked like a little kid. So the other thing I'll say is I ran into 2 friends of mine that I went to high school with, and they invited me to a couple of house parties. I said, I'll meet you there in my car. I was at both of those house parties for about 10 or 15 minutes, and I left. It was when that was the first time I realized that I could not relate to people my own age. They were still high school kids. I was no longer a high school kid. I felt like I had aged like 20 years, but I couldn't identify with them. I applied to go back home to Idaho State University, where is my hometown, and was accepted. And everybody looked at me as a high school kid. And it wasn't until second semester, most of the guys I was in class with were Vietnam veterans. So we went through the registration line, and the girl said to me, are you still claiming your GI benefits? And I said, yes. And everybody turned around and looked at me. They said, you were in the military? And I said, yeah. He said, well, you never said anything. I said, no, you never asked. Back then, the issue was so vivid in everybody's mind, if you didn't talk about it, they wouldn't ask you, because they figured you probably saw some real serious stuff. And so nobody ever bothered me. As a result of that, I probably grounded myself quicker and better. Matter of fact, this friend of mine who was a gunship pilot, when I first told him, he got very upset that I had not told him. And I explained to him, I said, think about where I was and what I'm doing. I couldn't. But over the years, I finally explained it all to him. And he now understands. But he was the first one he told me. The first thing he said to me when I told him the story, he said, now it makes sense. And I said, what? He says, the way you look. When you came home, the way you looked at me. And I said, what do you mean? He says, kind of like you're looking at me now with that fatherly look in your eyes. And I said, well, over probably 20 years, he's gotten a lot out of me. The one thing he has never gotten out of me were medals that I received. I've never told him. The one thing I did tell him is when General Abrams came up from Saigon, he started presenting everybody medals, and he turned to me and he said, I'd been flying there longer than anybody. And he turned to me and said, you've been pretty busy. And I said, anybody in this operation is busy. It's pretty busy. It's just that they hadn't been there as long as I had. And at some point, I stopped him and I said, sorry, I said, I don't deserve all this. I was here to do a job, and I did that job to the best of my ability. Kind of took I found out you don't tell a 4-star general that you don't deserve what he's giving you. He took a half a step back, and he looked in my eyes, and he kind of got this funny grin. He said, all you young guys are the same. You're here to do a job. When somebody tries to, recognize that job that you did, you all have the same comment. I don't deserve this. I was here to do a job. And he said, trust me. He said, do you know how all this came? When you're on the ground, he says, you have to write an operational report for every operation involved in this. According to your colonel, he says, your operational reports very rarely reflected the operational reports of the other 5 men, the 2 in the gunship, and 3 guys in your group. I said, because I was writing, from my perspective, what happened. They were all writing on what they saw. And he says, that's why you deserve this. And I said, okay. My buddy kept it. He said to me, he said, let me get this straight one time. Actually, only a couple months ago. He says, you flew every day you were there. I said, yes. Unless you had wounded, you never left country. We used to fly into Air America strips, which were all over the place. And we'd do what's called a hot refuel. We never shut down. And we continued to fly and do our operations. He looked at me and said, you must have a boatload of air medals. I said, I didn't know what the air medal was. He says, it's a cumulative medal. You get 1 air medal for every 8 hours you've been flying in enemy airspace. And he says, based on what you told me, he says, you essentially got an air medal for every day you were there. He says, out of all those medals you got, did, one of the, I said, well, I had one that he gave me. I said, at this point, my ears were ringing. I said, I had one that had numbers on it. He says, what were the numbers? I said, 283. And he says, there you go. He says, you have 283 air medals. You were flying in enemy airspace for 283 days. He said, I'll tell you another fun fact. I said, what's that? He says, during the Vietnam War, the average combatant, he said, some guys did more, some guys did less, but the average combatant only saw 75 to 80 days of actual combat. You saw 3.5 times more combat than they did. He says, I hope that helps you justify what the general gave you. And I said, I guess somewhat it does. He told me, I said, I thought what we were doing was normal. He says, it was not normal. He said, I don't think I saw 10% of the air combat you did. He says, my right-handed guy, I didn't see anywhere near that combat. He says, now I understand a lot more about you. Okay.
And this is how we've ended off. Did you have any questions?
No.
This is how we've ended off all of them so far. If you could describe your experience in 1 or 2 words, what would those words be?
Well, it's going to take more than 1 or 2 words. Usually when I tell people about, well, the one thing I tell them is one of the most incredible odysseys I've ever been on in my life, ever. But that's the only way I can state it. It was an incredible experience. The other question people ask is, if you had to do it again, would you? You bet you are. In a heartbeat, I'd do it.
Would you change anything, or would you make everything stay the same?
I don't think there's anything I could change. You know, under the circumstances that we operate in, I don't think there's anything I can do to change it. But like I said, if I had to do it again, I would. Provided it had the same outcome. Then I came home.
Thank you for spending your time with us and helping our club preserve American history.
Well,